Well, hello. Are my mics working okay? Okay, I'm all wired up here. I'm going to talk about a project that I partnered with the University of Wyoming on a little while ago. So the first year that we ran this experiment was in 2015, and then we repeated it in 2016 at a different site, and I'll talk about that. So it'll hopefully give you some ideas on how you can use high tunnels and low tunnels for vegetable production. That was the focus. This was a project that was funded by the Wyoming Department of Agriculture's specialty crop grant. So the University of Wyoming had gotten this grant for a 2-year project, and the professor involved left with me here as his partner to carry it on. And it was actually a really fun project, so I'm glad I was able to work on it. So let's make sure I can click. There we go. Okay, so the primary project I am going to talk about is the low tunnel, high tunnel open row vegetable production. That's number one. And I believe I'll have time to actually talk about a second project that I also started the second year, looking at vegetable production with Wyoming's really poor quality groundwater. Do any of you have poor quality groundwater that you're having to deal with? So we'll talk about that project too. So that one ended up being very interesting as well. So we'll start with the tunnels. The project, this is definitely established as a research project. So not so much just a general interest or just a community educational opportunity, but research. So we had established this experimental design where we had 5 different crops randomized in different plots on different rows. So there's lots of fun science organization here. So we had 4 rows in a high tunnel, and then we had, for the first trial at Wyoming, 2 rows outside of the high tunnel. Half of each row was covered with a low tunnel and the other half was not covered. So what I wanted to point out, a couple things here, is we do use a plastic mulch cover on a raised bed. And underneath the plastic mulch are 2 drip lines of drip tape to irrigate the crops. So it's very energy efficient, and we have this extra layer of not only weed control, but it helps warm the soil as well, which is a benefit to the plants. We did that both inside and outside under the low tunnels and the open rows. The plants, I'll go over the plants that we planted in a second. This is the second year's setup. So what had happened is the University of Wyoming had moved out here to the Adams Ranch, and they wanted to move the vegetable production tunnel systems out here as well. And so they moved a high tunnel, actually 2 high tunnels, oops, wrong one again. High tunnel out here, you can see the edge of it, inside structure, and then we were able to have 4 separate rows for the outdoor low tunnel open. And for that one, 2 of the rows were covered with a low tunnel and 2 of the rows were not covered. The vegetables that we did in this trial were actually selected by Dr. Jelyaskov, who's the one who had established the grant, but they worked out really great. So we had Hungarian wax peppers, beef master tomatoes, the early Russian cucumbers, which you cannot get in the US, you have to get them from Canada, and early green broccoli and contender bush beans. And as far as what the actual setup, how we grew them, we did the mounded rows with the black plastic mulch, drip irrigation, and the rows were divided into 5-foot plots, each with 2 to 5 plants, depending on how big those plants got. So obviously the cucumbers, you can plant 5 plants in one of those little spaces. Now, because of this actually different locations, there's also differences in how the tunnels were designed. So the first tunnel at Wyoming was 20 foot by 70 foot in size, about 12 foot tall, and we were able to have 4 rows that were 60 foot long there. Do you all know where Wyoming is? So if you go out kind of west of town here, that's where UW's original research station is located, and they still do their open field your dry land production out there. We had the 2 outer rows of vegetables that were half covered with low tunnel and half not. And then the low tunnels, we'll look at them again in another picture, but we have metal frames for our low tunnels, and we covered them with a 6 mil poly, which is your typical greenhouse film. And the summer season for 2015 was from May 27th to October 23rd, so that's pretty good for Wyoming. Initially was probably thought of as a season extension project, but this did not end up being a season extension project because the tunnels and the plantings had to be put into the ground after the ground had dried enough. And by then, it was time to plant everything. So we didn't really have any early season extension on these experiments. And as far as end of the season extension for both years, maybe got an extra week or two, but both years we had a super hard freeze right at the end of the growing season, and that wiped out all of our setups. So no season extension, but we are going to see a difference in how much was produced under each setup, at least for the first year. The second year at Adams Ranch, here the high tunnel was a bigger high tunnel. It was 30 by 96, taller, 13 feet. We did have the 4 rows that were 60 feet long, but actually the rows were a little bit longer, and so there was some extra space there. Karen Panter from UW had some sunflowers growing as a project, so we were using some other space in there as well. And then we had the 4 outer rows for the low tunnel and the open rows. Now here's where we get a little bit of the trouble. The 2016 year was kind of not a very successful year, and I'm going to spend most of my time after this little bit talking about the 2015 year. We attempted to cover the low tunnels, but they kept blowing away. So that was a problem. And then even at the end of the year, the high tunnel blew away as well. So there's a reason for that. And it is the Wyarno had that big white barn in the background. Did you notice that in the picture? It had a windbreak. There's no windbreak in the Adams Ranch area. And the 2016 actually was a very windy year. So it was a little problematic doing the high tunnel at that particular location. Okay, so the plants that we were growing, the Hungarian wax. How many of you have grown Hungarian wax peppers? Nice heat, not too hot, but a little bit of spice there. Good flavor, super productive peppers. So if you want a really productive pepper, this is a great one. We harvest the peppers when they were about 4 to 6 inches. Not maybe quite as mature. They get a nice orange glow to them when they're truly mature, or even more orange if you want more sweetness. We picked them when they were yellow. And so, okay, this is a research project, and I like showing off my the research results. So here's some data to analyze. We got our first harvest right at the end of June, and so we're seeing data points here in July. The high tunnels, I actually separated out the 2 rows there's 4 rows in the high tunnel, right? So 2 and 2, so we have 2 data points for our high tunnel. So there's some variation there sometimes. So blue and red are the production in the high tunnel. The yellow with the square is the low tunnel, and then the green line with the diamonds are the open rows. And right away, you probably see the Hungarian wax peppers liked being under plastic. Now they're under plastic the whole growing season. Obviously in the high tunnel, they're not going to take the plastic off of that. The low tunnels, we left the plastic on the low tunnels as well throughout the season, but we rolled up the sides to let air through. And so really good production here. The graph, if you're looking at numbers, if you're really analytical, the numbers on the graph are in grams. But the numbers on the left there are in pounds. And so for the whole year, the high tunnel production wasn't quite as productive as the low tunnels. So I got a little bit more pepper production out of the low tunnels that year. And then the open production was lower. Now, peppers like it hot. They like a warm temperature when they're growing. They don't like it super hot all day long, all night long, but they do like warmer temperatures and will be more productive. So that was probably why they were more productive here. Another little key piece of information, production went through October, but you have a pretty sharp decline from August to October as the peppers were pretty much petering out by this time as well. The beans were the tender bush beans. These are also super productive beans, nice long green tender pods. I like them a lot. They freeze well, so if you like to have a lot left over, you can freeze them. The production here, a little bit different. Again, the blue and the red are the high tunnels. Yellow is the low tunnels, and then the green is the uncovered. And again, better production under plastic. And it preferred the high tunnels to the low tunnels for some reason. So we got about twice as much productivity out of the high tunnel versus the low tunnel, and not very much happening outside. Now, I'm not sure why they weren't doing well outside, but they didn't like something that year. But normally you can grow these just fine in the field. And again, August is our peak month of productivity. The broccoli, now I'm not a big broccoli grower. I really have not had a lot of experience with broccoli, but this broccoli did pretty well. I was impressed. Most broccoli will produce one big flower head that you want to cut off. And then if you leave it, you'll get nice little branches of small little broccoli heads. And so we kept it going. We just had the one big head and then let it grow the smaller ones and kept harvesting those as well. This is a pretty tall plant, which is somewhat problematic with a low tunnel that's left on year-round or summer long. So for this one, broccoli this year also did really well in the high tunnels. Its peak harvest was in September, and then as far as growing out in the open or under the low tunnel, equal productivity there. And again, this plant is too tall for our low tunnels, so the plastic on top of the plant was a barrier to productivity there. Cucumber, early Russian cucumber is a long slicing cucumber. You can pickle it, but you're pickling, the sliced pickles more than, your regular pickle-sized pickles. They can get really big, 5 to 6 inches, and they don't get as bitter as some of our pickles do when they get that big. So they don't get fat and yellow, they get long and green. So it's a really nice cultivar. The cucumber did something a little bit different. It liked the low tunnel. So we have yellow on the top. Low tunnel productivity was highest throughout the season. It liked that extra protection and extra heat from the plastic. The high tunnel was still pretty productive, and it was pretty productive in the open as well. Question?
Did you trellis them, Amy, or just let them grow?
Grow on the ground, yeah. There was no extra support other than for the tomatoes that needed it. So on the ground, on the plastic. The plastic was a pretty good structure there. Just a note on the plastic, that black plastic can get really hot, especially when it's in the open. And so sometimes if your plants are in contact with that plastic and they don't have shade or they're not shading themselves like the cucumbers can do, you can get burning on your plants. So you do want your plants, for most of them, to grow up and away from the plastic so they're not touching that hot plastic. The tomatoes that were chosen were the Beef Master tomatoes, which are big, juicy tomatoes, pretty productive, fairly short season, 80-day season, large fruit. They do split when they get too big or get a big burst of water, so you get those cracked tomatoes that then aren't as pretty. These are an indeterminate tomato. What do you know about indeterminate tomatoes? What's that?
I remember if I'm doing the opposite. You don't have to prune them?
You should prune them to some, but what they're doing is they're going to continue growing and vining and getting taller and producing new branches with new flowers. So this is also a growth habit that isn't great for low tunnels because they want to keep growing up, and you can't trellis them any higher than your low tunnel is. So they were growing into the plastic as well. So what we see here initially, this one's kind of fun. So we get an initial high production or harvest early in August from the low tunnel and the open. And then the high tunnel actually allowed us to extend the season, and we had a secondary high harvest here. And so we had like 2 months of really good harvest because we had all 3 systems of growing that year. You know, and each one over 200 pounds of tomatoes, which is a lot of tomatoes. So this is what the high tunnel in Wyoming looked like at the end of the season. The vegetables are really filled in, they're healthy. We did initially, we actually didn't end up using them, but we initially had planned to do a low tunnel, high tunnel within that high tunnel. So you see the low tunnel hoops here. We never covered those hoops. They had already just been put up and I didn't take them down. So,
what would be the purpose of that double cover?
So with a double cover, you can increase the heat. And so if you really are trying to do season extension, having the low tunnel earlier and then later in the season can allow you to escape those cold periods that we get. So that's the What's that?
How tall is the low tunnel?
The low tunnels are about 2.5 feet, maybe 3. And they're 4 feet wide. So maybe, I don't think they're 4 feet tall. I think they're more like 3 feet. Should go out and measure them. You can see the low tunnel in the background there too. So the low tunnel here is covered. The sides are rolled up and then clamped to the poles so that air can flow. So they're not getting too hot, but they're still going to be a little warmer than the plants that are out in the open. Okay, so some of the conclusions from this first year's trial is pepper production was increased by growing under the high tunnels and the low tunnels. So these are all things I've already pointed out. Broccoli and bean production was best in the high tunnel. Tomato and cucumber production was slightly higher in the high tunnels, or in the tunnels, but not a whole lot. So we still had really good production in the open rows. And although you didn't see this in the data, the season was extended about 1 week under plastic, but because of a hard freeze, it ended everything, and we were done in October. Okay, here's what 2016 looked like. Just day after day, we were going back out there and putting that low tunnel back on the hoops. Of course, they were falling over on the open rows and disturbing the open row vegetables as well. And so we just ended up giving up on covering low tunnels that year. It wasn't really until September that the high tunnel top blew off, but it did eventually blow off. Now, the high tunnel was a larger structure. It had bigger openings on the side and the back. I don't think they had it on as tight as they did in Wyoming, and maybe they didn't have some other straps on it to hold that plastic. I wasn't the one that put it up, so I'm not sure what all went into it, but it wasn't Jeff. So, and since then they've actually been able to keep, they have shade fabric and different fabrics on there, so they still use that high tunnel structure, just not for vegetable production. So this experiment, we went through it, we collected all the data, harvested all the vegetables, gave away the vegetables, but we don't have really good data to show you. I don't have any low tunnel data to show you. And because I think that the high tunnel was so large and airy, I don't really have a lot of we're not seeing a lot of difference between the high tunnel and the open rows either. And so as I quickly go through these graphs, you're not going to see much difference going on. Productivity was still really good, so comparable or even higher for some of the vegetables than 2015. And this is because it was still a really good year to grow vegetables. Even though it was windy, it was really warm. It's actually a little bit hotter in 2016. And so we still had plenty of productivity. It just didn't work this year. So the peppers, did a little better out in the open than they did in the high tunnel. And if you're, the blue is the high tunnel with the circle, and green with the triangle is the uncovered or open ones. The beans did the same in both situations. So here the beans did great out in the open, where they didn't like it the year before. The early green broccoli, however, was not very productive at all. If you don't remember, the numbers are in the double digits. In 2015, we're barely getting 5 pounds this year. This was a hot year. Broccoli is a cold crop, a coliferous as well. It doesn't like it too hot. It takes a while to be productive, but when it gets too hot, it just goes to flower right away, and you don't get those beautiful heads. And so we just weren't getting anything from broccoli. Oops, too fast. The cucumbers, super productive in both the high tunnel and the open. The tomato actually did better out in the open than it did in the high tunnel. I'm not sure why, why it was that different. And so just a quick follow-up. In general, windbreaks are important. So that's what we were missing at the Adams Ranch. There was nothing there to keep the wind from taking our covers off. We could have done more to stabilize things. The structures are built with an east to west direction, so that the area, the biggest surface area is facing, is that right? No, north-south. The biggest surface areas were facing east-west, so any westerly winds are going to pick up that surface area and take off with them. So different orientations can help with your wind problems. The early green broccoli and the Beefmaster are too tall for low tunnels. This was evidently clear the first time, but just to reinforce that. High tunnels will need more irrigation. So maybe some of the problems we saw with our high tunnel that second year not being as productive is we weren't giving it as much irrigation as it needed. Anything raining outside will get that precipitation, but that precipitation doesn't make it into your high tunnel. And I think there may have been a difference there, but I haven't analyzed that data. I'd go back and look at some weather data. But still plenty of productivity. Lots of vegetables can be grown. Questions? So actually one last on the high tunnel, low tunnel. Just diversify your planting. So one year we had different results in the second year, but because we had different things going on, we had plenty of productivity. Any questions on the high tunnel, low tunnel, open row experiments? Yeah.
Is the plastic mulch cover, is that the same as like the weed cover, like for trees, or I don't know what this plastic mulch cover.
It's a little thinner. So if you're doing a plastic weed barrier around your trees, it's usually a little thicker. So that it lasts for a long time. So the plastic mulch cover is not meant to stay there for more than 1 year. So you usually remove it year after year. And it does break down pretty quickly. But it is an impermeable product, so it doesn't have any pores to let water through. And it is really intended primarily for weed control around your vegetables or your fruit. They use it a lot in strawberry production as well.
And you had your irrigation tape underneath.
The drip tape is underneath, yeah. Which the black, I'm not a huge proponent of plastic, but I'm still looking for an alternative to it. It works really well. The advantage, another advantage of that black plastic mulch is it keeps the water from evaporating out of the soil. And so you don't need as much irrigation because of that black plastic mulch.
Because I think you said you needed more irrigation.
But in the high tunnel, there's no precipitation. So the precipitation, even though the black plastic's impermeable, it's not that big. So precipitation can diffuse into the soil and still reach the plants. And the plants' roots are going out too from those rows. Yeah. Ted?
Would you recommend getting like some straw bales or something as a temporary windbreak till other ones could be established?
Something like that could be, even certain fencing products could be put up to create some blocks. And then putting a tree windbreak would be really nice. or another structure out there. They're not going to build anything else permanent out there, but so yeah.
One of the things back in Ohio, the growers were getting 2 seasons out of their plastic mulch. They just put a new set of holes. Like in the peppers, the guy I worked for, they pull all the old peppers out, and halfway between the second year, they would put an opening and plant another crop in there.
So they weren't having to pull it up every year.
Right, you got 2 seasons out.
So yeah, depending on the season, I think that's probably very possible, and how big your holes are. You could probably use your holes too. We get pretty high ultraviolet radiation too, which kind of breaks down things a little faster. But you might be able to get 2 seasons out of that plastic.
You know, we do get 305 days of sunshine.
Yeah, that's true. Any other questions about the high tunnel, low tunnel?
So there's no like medium tunnel? Is it pretty much been researched like we have
Yeah,
low tunnels? And we have just wondering.
The high tunnels are primarily constructed so you can walk through. So it's a space that you can do things in and grow your product. In the low tunnel, it's designed to be something you can take on and off so that you can get to your plants. So one thing I didn't reinforce, there was a picture earlier on, I think. It's easiest to plant your rows before you cover with the plastic, because once the plastic's on, you have to climb in underneath it to harvest if you're going to leave it on year round. And so some people will just put low tunnel plastic on at the beginning and the end of the season to do that season extension and protect the crops during the worst weather events that can happen. And then they'll take off the plastic in the middle of the summer so they don't have to fight with it. So it's a little bit of labor, and it's not super pleasant to work under that low tunnel. And then a medium tunnel, I just can't. I don't think that would be useful.
There's a product called, or a style called cat tunnel, or caterpillar tunnel, and they are
Oh,
big
sure.
enough to walk into, but they are, 7, 8 feet tall, maybe at the max.
Oh my
And
gosh.
just enough for you to get into. Farmer's Friend Incorporated, I think they manufacture and sell a kit that's pretty affordable, or you can probably design one.
Is it a temporary structure? Is it meant to go on and
No,
take off?
There's steel hoops that are going on the ground.
Okay.
With posts, and then it just gives you and then there's no fancy roll up, but you just kind of scrunch the side of the plastic up, and it has a series of ropes that go over the top, kind of diagonal to kind of pinch that plastic to the frame. So there's no wiggle wire, and it seems to be pretty popular with market gardeners. For using those, or a cheaper alternative.
something simple to put up,
I worry
maybe?
about the wind, though.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, put the straw bale windbreak on or something.
Any other questions? Yeah.
This is not so much the data, just more of the structure, which I probably should have asked Jeff. Sorry, Jeff. The low tunnels don't have any kind of venting, right?
No, just rolling up the sides, and then the front and the back can stay
But they
open.
would get hotter.
They do get hotter. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another question about the doors. On the high tunnel, I see some doors going in and some doors going out. Is one better than another, or?
Can I take a stab at that?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
If they open up, there's a better opportunity for the wind to catch them and rip them off.
Okay,
If they open in, they're protected.
good to know. Thank you.
You're limiting space when you open it.
Sure.
Okay. Good. Any other questions about the tunnels? Then I'll quickly go into this project. So this project I started in 2016, and I also repeated it in 2017 and got basically the same results. So I'm just going to show you the first year's results. So while I was out at Wyarno, I was curious about the groundwater, because they do have groundwater. They have wells out there, but the water is really poor quality. It's high metals, high salts. There's nothing in there that looks good. Everything turns orange. If you've lived out in Wyarno, you've seen that. And so how we irrigated the plants out at Wyarno is we brought in city water and put it in a big tank and then just gravity fed that into our drip tape. It was pretty efficient and it wasn't that difficult to do. We just had to bring in the city water and refill that tank throughout the summer. And so I wanted to see how that groundwater would affect the vegetable production in comparison to the city water that we were bringing in. And I was doing a little bit more with the physiology. I won't show you the physiology, and also some of the soil quality and texture characteristics also I won't show you, because in the end, like the high tunnel, low tunnel, it was a pretty successful growing experience both summers. Everything grew. Let's give away the end of the story there. So we have jalapeno peppers, so I picked a different pepper, and then the early Russian cucumbers we used again. Used the mounded rows with the plastic mulch and the drip irrigation tape. Just because we were irrigating the same way with the city water that gravity fed, we did the same thing with the well water. And the same plot layout for the vegetables. So the initial picture you see looks a lot like the first pictures we had. So we were at Wyarno, there's the big white barn there. You can see that there's 4 rows of vegetables. Alternating rows were watered with the well water versus the city water. And this is middle of the season. Can you tell which row is watered with which? They all look great and healthy and happy, right? Here's a comparison of the water. The first year, the city water was a little weird. It was fairly high in pH, high alkalinity. I don't know why, but every time I tested it, and I tested it regularly throughout the season, I kept getting this high pH. The second year, it was back to normal around 7. But other than that, our well water, if you're familiar with your water characteristics here, the well water is also fairly alkaline, has a lot of conductivity, so there's a lot of salts in there conducting electrical charge. You can see the same kind of relationship here with a high level of dissolved solids. This is typically salts, very alkaline compared to the city water, even though the pH was weird. Very hard water, as you would expect from Wyarno's water. Still more high alkalinity, and then it has high chloride. This is really not something to be concerned about with watering vegetables. High sulfate, that's super high compared to the city water. Calcium was high, magnesium's high, and then something plants really don't like, sodium was high relative to the city water. So this is crummy water. If you asked any agricultural extension person if you should grow vegetables with this water, they would tell you not to. Don't do that. And over time, even if you can get plants to grow like I did, this is going to damage your soil. And so you'll have to do things to remediate your soil over time if you're irrigating with this water. So,
Did you amend your soil before you planted?
I did not. It was not amended. It was just that clay soil that Wyarno has. And I did give them, they had the slow release fertilizer pellets just to add a little fertilizer. They all had the same. No extra sulfur or anything else, yeah.
Because I offset a little bit with all the minerals in the water. Now, I can't say for sure, but I've been told that Demopolis, they use the hot springs water, and it does an excellent job of growing vegetables, and it should be full of everything.
Yeah, at least sulfur, yeah.
The only way you're going to know is try it and see how they react.
See.
But you didn't try the well water on any of these plants?
No, it was the jalapenos and the cucumbers were watered with the well water.
Did it plug up your drip line?
It didn't for the growing season, it was fine. Now the drip tape has these little wide slashes in them for irrigation, and so those did not get plugged up.
Sometimes drip will.
Yeah, especially rounded drip lines and the little emitters will get clogged up with the salts, and
But the flat doesn't.
the flat didn't. But they also got new drip tape the second year, so it was all replaced and refreshed the second year. So just showing you the first year, and it's a little confusing, my graphs here. The blue, so I have 2 rows for each to have some replication. I didn't pool that data or do anything. I'm just showing you the results for each row. The first group of data is the well water, and the second group of data is the city water. The well water was the crummy water. If you just glance at that graph, there's no difference between the well water and the city water. There's differences in the two rows. And that, I believe, was due to difference in irrigation pressure in those drip lines. The row with the higher column was getting more water in general than the row with this lower column on that graph. So just getting a little bit better irrigation, and so needed to do something to equalize my drip irrigation pressures. As far as total productivity here, the cucumbers, city was a little bit less than the well water. And for the jalapeno peppers, same kind of thing. Well water was very consistent for those two rows. City water had one row that did a little bit better than the other row, but still no real distinctive difference between these two water sources. The well water this time didn't produce quite as much peppers, but they're pretty close. So 36 pounds from city water and 31 almost from the well water. So super productive. The plants were healthy and happy. There was no disease appearance. The vegetables all looked good. So what's happening here? Let's go back to this. Besides just the low dose of irrigation, I'm just dripping that in. I'm not overwhelming the plants in the soil with that really poor quality well water. So they're not getting overwhelmed with the sodium that's in that water. They're also, getting from that well water sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, which are all nutrients that the plant needs. And the city water, of course, doesn't have very much of that. And so they were getting extra fertilizer from that city water that they weren't getting from the city well water.
Was the well water potable? Or maybe you had
No, it wasn't portable.
more nutrients like nitrogen?
I don't think it didn't, well, actually, I didn't test for nitrates or any of those other nutrients, so I don't think it would have had nitrates in it.
Soil test do you have a soil test for the garden site? Because the soil might be buffering, some of that.
Right, I do have soil tests for that data, or that site, and I can't remember. That's a good point. So yeah, the soil could very well be buffering as well.
You think if you were to overhead water with that well water, you could change this by putting too much water on rather than the drip?
I think overhead watering would have been damaging to those crops. Not only from just too much water, but then you're putting that salt on the plant itself. Yeah, and the plants my guess would they'd respond very badly to that.
Was there any difference in taste?
There wasn't that I could tell. Yeah, nobody else, I asked students and nobody said they could see any difference. You can put all the vegetables together, there's no way to tell which ones came from which plant. So what I think is happening here, without doing further research, is that drip irrigation into that plastic mulch not only is an effective way to grow the vegetables, but it's mediating that impact of that poor water quality on the vegetables. So they're still doing quite well. And the production for that first year was good, even though the water's pH was a little high, which again, the soil could be buffering that pH problem.
Were you transported the city water out somewhere on that? So was that also controlled? Or was that a different planting spot?
Ask me that again.
You were hauling water out from where I know?
Yeah. From the city, there's that place where you can fill your tanks with water. Yeah, so we were hauling it out there. And even with that crummy water, at least for the short term, you could grow vegetables. If you're interested in trying this, I think we could look into this a little bit more. You would just want to do something with your soil, maybe take a year off and add organic material and stuff to that soil that you've been adding that poor water, that salty water too. In production farming, they will flush that soil out with just the excess amount of water to try to move that salt. There's some other compound minerals that you can add in to try to counter the amount of sodium that you're adding to the soil. So there are things you can do to also mediate that poor quality water.
I just went through with the hydroponic section, and one of the things that was important for them was oxygenation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you weren't getting as good of oxygenated water from the hauling it is from the company.
Yeah, I'm not sure, in the open field production like this, oxygen's not as important if you're not flooding your soil. If your soil is super wet, there's going to be an oxygen problem, but the soil was allowed to dry. Yeah, but for hydroponics, the oxygen's very important. I think that's it. So these projects couldn't have been done without a lot of help. I had some partnerships, not only with the University of Wyoming Sheridan Research Station, but also University of Wyoming in Laramie. Dr. Andrew Parsikian was my soil biology partner for that second project. I had funding from the Wyoming Department of Agriculture as well as University of Wyoming's EPSCoR grants. And Embry helped pay for my students to help with all of the management of these projects. So I think that's all I have. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, after 3 hours of good talks, I think it's time for a lunch break.